There is a list at Harvard that you will never see. It is maintained by the Development Office, the office that tracks donations. If your family's name is on it, your chance of admission goes from 3% to 33%. It's not published, it's not searchable, and it's updated every year. It's called the Dean's Interest List. It's been running in some form since 1922, when it was invented to solve a problem Harvard's president described in writing as too many Jewish students getting in on their exam scores. The Jewish quotas ended decades ago. The list didn't. The preference didn't. The machinery survived, and now it does something else. 70% of Harvard's legacy applicants are white. 43% of its white admits got in through legacy status, athletic recruitment, or family donations. For Black students, that number is under 16%, not because Black families don't value Harvard, because Black families weren't allowed through the door until the 1960s, which means they've had 2 generations to build what white families have had a century to compound. In 2023, the Supreme Court said universities can no longer consider race to help students get in. It said nothing about the list. Race-conscious admissions designed to repair a century of exclusion survived 50 years. Legacy preference designed to enforce it just turned 100. In the fall of 1922, the president of Harvard University had a problem. His name was Abbott Lawrence Lowell, and the problem, as he described it to his colleagues, was that too many of the wrong students were getting in. Jewish students, the children of Eastern European immigrants, mostly from public high schools in New York and Boston, had been earning their way into Harvard on the only thing the university claimed to care about: their exam scores. By 1922, Jewish enrollment had reached 21.5% in a country where Jews were 3.5% of the population. They were, by every academic measure, overperforming, and Harvard's administration treated this as a crisis. Lowell formed a committee. Its official name was the Committee on Methods for Sifting Candidates for Admission. Not selecting, sifting. Its internal correspondence referred to Jewish students as the Hebrew element and described them as academically strong but deficient in character. The committee chairman wrote in 1923 that the Jewish student was a better scholar than the Gentile, but more prone to dishonesty. This was not a fringe position. This was institutional strategy, documented and filed. Columbia had tried an explicit quota. The backlash was immediate. So Harvard did something more elegant. It replaced the exam-based system with something it called holistic admissions. Applications would now be evaluated on character, on leadership, on personality, on letters of recommendation, on in-person interviews, on geographic diversity, which meant recruiting from states with fewer Jews. Every one of these criteria was designed to do the same thing: create a space between the score and the decision where judgment could live. And judgment, unlike a number, can be steered without anyone seeing the hand on the wheel. Harvard issued a public statement in 1926. It said, "It will be said that Harvard is discriminating on grounds of race." That will not be true. The Jewish enrollment dropped. The system worked as designed. And embedded inside that new system was a preference for the sons of alumni. If your father had gone to Harvard, you received what the admissions office called an additional look. The alumni of Harvard in 1922 were white, Protestant, and wealthy. Their sons would be too. Giving them a preference guaranteed that the institution would reproduce itself, its demographics, its class competition, its culture year after year without anyone ever having to write the word quota again. So when legacy preference was installed, it didn't just lock in a white Protestant majority, it started a clock. Every year the preference ran, the families inside the system compounded their advantage, and every year a community was locked out of the institution. The gap between those with legacy status and those without grew wider. By the time Harvard began admitting Black students in meaningful numbers, which were the late 1960s and early 1970s, white families had already been accumulating legacy eligibility for half a century. The Jewish quotas were quietly phased out by the 1960s. The explicit discrimination ended, but the machinery it created, holistic admissions, the personal rating, the legacy preference, did not. It stayed, it adapted, it found new uses. In a study that used Harvard's own admission data from 2009 to 2014, economists found that 43% of white students admitted to Harvard were recruited athletes, legacies, children of faculty, or on the dean's interest list, a category for relatives of donors. 43%. For Black students, that number was under 16%. 75% of the white students admitted through those categories would have been rejected if they had been evaluated the same way as every other white applicant, 3 out of 4. They were not admitted on merit. They were admitted on proximity. And here's how the machine works. A family donates to a university. The university is a 501c3 nonprofit. The donation is tax deductible. The federal government subsidizes the gift. The family's child applies. The child's name appears on the dean's interest list, where each applicant is rated based on how important the donor is to Harvard. The child is admitted 5 to 6 times the rate of a non-legacy applicant. The child receives a credential. The credential converts inherited access into earned merit. The child graduates, earns more, donates back. The cycle repeats. Now watch what happens when a Black family enters the cycle. First generation, no legacy status, no donor history, no dean's list. They get in on merit alone, if they get in at all. They graduate, their child applies with legacy status, but the family hasn't had 3 generations to donate. They haven't built the relationship with the development office. The preference exists on paper, but the compounding hasn't had time to work. A white family with a century of Harvard alumni is not in the same system as a Black family with 1 generation. In 2018, a Black woman who graduated from Harvard wrote about what it felt like to watch the legacy admissions debate from inside the building. She had not arrived through legacy. No one in her family had, and one of her great-grandfathers had a 6th grade education. Her great-grandmother never finished high school. Her grandparents had gone to historically Black college in the 1940s, decades before any elite white university would have considered admitting them. She was not the first person in her family to go to college, but she was the first to go to Harvard. And that entrance, she wrote, lifted her family into an echelon of privilege to which they had never been granted access. She did the work, she graduated, she built a career, she had a son, and for the first time in her family's history, that son would be a legacy applicant. 1 generation. That's what her family had built. 1 generation of eligibility in a system that has been compounding for white families since 1922. Her son would check the box, but he would not have the donor relationship, the development office history, the dean's interest list placement that comes from a century of giving. He would have legacy status. He would not have legacy infrastructure. And then the conversation shifted. After the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, people started saying that legacy admissions should go too. The logic was clean. If you can't consider race, you shouldn't consider lineage. Fairness, consistency, merit. She agreed with the principle. She wrote that she agreed, but also wrote what it felt like to have waited this long, to have finally gotten through the door, to have earned the one advantage that white families had been passing down for a century, and to be told in the same decade her son became eligible that the advantage was being reconsidered. Not when it was white families compounding it for 100 years. Now, when Black families had 1 generation in the system. That is the cost of compound interest on access. 70% of Harvard's legacy applicants are white. After the Supreme Court banned race-conscious admissions in 2023, minority enrollment dropped immediately. The court said you could no longer consider race to help students. It said nothing about considering wealth to help families. It struck down the remedy and preserved the advantage in the same breath. It is not that Black families were excluded from the preference. It is that by the time they were included, the preference had already done its work, a century of it, for everyone else. At Princeton in 2000, of 567 legacy students enrolled, 10 were Latino, 4 were Black. 4 out of 567. That is not a program that failed to include people of color. That is a program that was never built to include them, running in an institution that did not admit them in meaningful numbers until the preference was already half a century old. At Princeton, legacy applicants were admitted at 6 times the overall rate. At Stanford, 3 times. At Notre Dame, Georgetown, UVA, double. Across every institution that tracks the data, the pattern holds. Legacy applicants are admitted at higher rates with lower credentials, not occasionally, systematically. And the beneficiaries are overwhelmingly the families who have been inside the longest. The word they use is merit. It appears in every admissions brochure, every rejection letter, every dean's statement about the integrity of the process. Merit. But the system that determines merit was designed in a specific room by specific men to solve a specific problem. There were too many of the wrong students getting in. The criteria were chosen not to find talent, but to filter it. And the preference at the center of that system, the preference for the children of graduates, has outlived the men who made it. The prejudice that inspired it, and every legal challenge to every other form of admissions preference in U.S. history. 100 years, the only tool that was closing the gap, race-conscious admissions, is gone. The tool that built the gap is still running, and every year, the list is updated, the preferences are applied, and the children of the people who got in last time get in again. Not because they earned it, but because the system was never designed to measure earning. It was designed to measure belonging. And belonging at these institutions is inherited. That's the part they leave out.